Okay, friends, so if you watched the last video, I did not know what this video topic was, and then I pulled it up and I was like, of course, this is really intriguing to me. So I don't know how this is going to land with you. I never do. But let's go for a ride. Okay, so the present moment, talking about generational transition of power. As you can tell, I kind of like generations and generational study and how generations acted throughout time, history, that kind of thing. I'm interested in that. So generational transition of power. Why is our future so challenging? Okay. I want to invite us to consider how power changes from one generation to the next in the church. I think this process applies in many contexts beyond the church, but I want to think about it in our context specifically. This is a developing theory of mine, so perhaps others have articulated this better, and I'm just late to the show, or better than I do, about to, or perhaps it's completely off base. Though obviously, if I thought it was off base, I wouldn't be saying it. So though obviously, I think there's truth here. You're invited to offer your feedback about how true this narrative feels for you. In church, we often want to avoid conversations around power, but power is present in many contexts. Theologian Paul Tillich wrote, "In any encounter of a person with another, power is active, the power of personal radiation expressed in language and gestures, in the glances of the eye and the sounds of the voice, in face and figure and movement, expressed in what one is personally and what one represents socially. Every encounter, whether friendly or hostile, whether benevolent or indifferent, is in some way, unconsciously or consciously, a struggle of power with power. Power is always present in power is present in every situation, and in healthy churches, the struggle of power, using Tillich's phrase, is met with open arms as a conversation relationally. Power can be defined as a form of control, but it also could be understood as influence. Mutual influence over each other is a balanced approach to understanding power. I see where you're coming from and you see where I'm coming from, and we meet somewhere in the middle is not something that we should shy away from. Power is not something we should shy away from. If you're feeling uncomfortable with that language of power, however, then consider this a theory about generational leadership. I'm going to be using lots of images to help me to illustrate this theory. I'm actually going to go off camera completely and jump to my computer here to do images. It's important to pay attention to the colors of each image. Let's start through it, and I focus this more on writing than in talking, because I can talk it out, versus on writing, it's more static. So let's start, though, by talking about 3 generations that are represented within congregations. So I'll see you in a bit. So we have the 3 generations, which are the elder generation, the current generation, and the young generation. So let's start slowly to walk through each of these 3 generations. When a person first begins participating in a church, they are part of the young generation. While many times this can be understood as chronological age, it does not necessarily have to be. It could also be the number of years active within the church. As time goes on, the young generation eventually gains positions of power or leadership. I'm going to use the word power, though. This moves them from being in the young generation to the current generation that holds power in the church. The years passed. Eventually, the new young generation comes along, and when appropriate time comes, the current generation retires and assumes the elder generation position. This transition from the young to the current to the elder is the normal process of power transfer from one generation to another. Let's go through this process even more slowly, though. This is where we need to look at colors. The background color for each generation represents the values, the culture, and the norms of doing and handling things. It represents that particular generation's status quo. When a generations transfer power, the entire church's status quo does slightly change to reflect those in leadership, which we will see more clearly taking it one step at a time. So let's imagine Sarah. Sarah is brand new to the church. She's part of the young generation. Sarah thinks that the church should use fair trade coffee for fellowship time for ethical and moral reasons. Sarah approaches the board chair, Eve, with an idea. Eve represents the current generation's power and leadership. Notice that the arrow, which represents the idea of using fair trade coffee, so imagine young Sarah and that arrow's her walking over to Eve, that's yellow because it's a yellow generation. Yellow idea, yellow generation. Eve's generation has been serving the same coffee for years. They like their coffee, or at least it meets their needs. Fair trade coffee is expensive. And with so many kinds of coffee, how are we going to select a new one that everyone will agree on? It just seems too complicated. So Eve's generation says to Sarah, thanks for the idea, but no. So notice the arrow, offshoot. It gets dismissed. Now young Sarah is a little deterred, but not a quitter. Sarah loves this church and is committed to working it through. Sarah ropes in other people, including Rebecca and Rachel. They all go to the board. Again, notice there's more arrows now. So there are 3 young arrows. And again, Eve's generation, comfortable in its position of power, rejects the idea. It says, thank you 3, but no. As time continues, Sarah garners more and more people from her generation that agree with her idea. However, she's also learning more about how Eve's generation leads things, how they think, and how to influence them. Sarah modifies her approach and her idea so that it does not sound so new or different than what's been done. Notice then that the blending of the two colors in the arrow to reflect this influence between the generations. So I talked about how fair trade coffee is more expensive, which it normally is. So let's say that Eve's generation would want a prepared cost of how that's going to be funded. So Sarah goes back to the drawing board and comes up with a way of funding the extra expense. So Sarah's approach to how to deal with this is changing based on how Eve's generation is treating the situation. Eventually, after years of this, Eve's generation is aging. It's tired. It can no longer handle doing the work it once did. The current generation has 2 options. So Eve's generation has 2 options. In order to be the most clear in this theory, I'm going to speak in 2 extremes. Option 1 is that they can gracefully say to Sarah's generation, we're older, we're tired, and we think you understand how to do things around here well enough that we're going to let you run things from now on. Option 2, on the extreme, is conflict-based. Rather than Eve's generation gracefully stepping down, they can fight many years with Sarah's generation until Eve's generation has either completely died off or the work for the church literally cannot happen because they are too old and frail to complete. Another possibility is that Sarah's generation forces Eve's generation out of power through bureaucratic processes. There are procedures. There is no blessing from one generation to another, but rather a throwing up of hands and walking away approach. This is unhealthy and it's unhelpful in the long run. But it also conditions Sarah's generation to cling on to that power longer than it should, because what Sarah experienced was a hard transition from Eve stepping down. So Sarah, whenever it's her time to step down, will also mirror that generational thing. So that's how we go back to the history of stuff and how it gets passed down. The culture gets passed down. So that's what I'm alluding to. So these 2 options, whether it's the gentle blessing of passing down or the more violent one or the more conflict-based one, these 2 options do lead to Eve's generation moving into the elder generation position. The image below shows, and this I guess on the screen, this one shows Sarah's generation moving to the current generation's position. And then we have a new young generation, Mary's generation, pop up on the scene. But notice the new blended color for Sarah. That generation used to be solid yellow, But as they became socialized with the previous generation, how they did things, they merged to be a blend between the original color yellow and Eve's generation color blue. This blending assures Eve's generation, the elder generation, that they can trust Sarah's generation in power. Sarah may not run exactly the things as Eve did, but it's close enough that the church feels comfortable for everyone. So you'll also notice that Mary has popped into the scene. As time progresses, Mary has an idea of sharing sandwiches in addition to coffee during fellowship time. The cycle continues, and maybe you can see it, maybe you can't, but there's a purple arrow going up from young, by the Y in young. And so the cycle continues by Mary bringing that idea to Sarah's group. And they say, as the generation before them, thanks for the idea, but no. And Mary is deterred, but just as much as Sarah was not. Mary's is deterred just as Mary was not. So Mary is not deterred, just as Sarah was not. Mary gathers Martha and Elizabeth and returns to Sarah. And yes, friends, you know what's coming. Mary only increases those who are supporting those sandwiches during the fellowship time, but Mary is also getting more clever. Oh, so that generation dismisses those ideas. So, as time goes on, Mary gathers more and understands how Sarah's generation thinks and how to influence them, as reflected in the changing of the arrows in the image below. So now it's yellow and blue and purple as the arrow. And eventually, just as Eve's generation stepped down, so too will Sarah's generation once it has enough assurance that Mary's generation will operate in a blended way of theirs, right? So you have to do a little bit of Sarah's generation's approach, which is now a blended of Eve's. And so Mary has to do that blended approach. And once she does that, then Mary is able to move up and Sarah's generation moves down, which is reflected here. So you'll see Sarah was always yellow and blue, and now Mary, at the current power, has a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of purple. And so Mary's position is now done. Mary's generation filled with colors, blue, yellow, and purple, will then move to the current generation position. And yes, a new young generation, Olivia, will arrive on the scene, and the cycle continues. It's worth saying that this is very simplistic, as you probably could tell, especially around the role of the elders, who completely disappear in this narrative, which is not accurate. All three of these generations are constantly interacting with each other, and there's even more generations behind the young generation, hence where did Sarah, Mary, and Olivia come from? And one could argue that there's a generation beyond elder for those who are homebound or live in care homes that can never participate in the life of the church anymore. But in churches all over the Western world, something new is happening that hasn't really occurred in the last few centuries. All of a sudden, churches are finding no young generation coming. Church decline is real. And so this is what the chart looks like. Something else has changed as well. Eve, Sarah, and Mary were committed to the church, so that when they faced opposition, they did not lose heart. They stuck with it, and they worked harder in the church to build community around them. Olivia, however, is young, and there are plenty of churches out there that are open to her ideas, going completely vegan to the food. So that's Olivia's idea. Olivia is saying, let's go vegan. Unlike previous generations, when Olivia presents her idea of veganism to Mary, and Mary's generation rejects the idea, it's not just the idea that goes away, Olivia goes away. People don't want to and are no longer committed to attending a particular congregation or even staying within a particular denomination to fulfill their spiritual needs. Rather, in our very consumeristic society, if we do not fulfill their spiritual needs at the first time, maybe second, and with lots of grace on their part, the third, then people walk away for church shopping. Generations prior didn't church shop. This is a new phenomenon, and new people have a very, very low tolerance for church fights. They don't want to come to church to fight or deal with bad behavior. So congregations have a history of lots of conflict. even buried conflict. And those having church bullies are not attractive. Congregations that have shallow relationships or limited experiences and focus on God are not attractive. So limited experiences and limited focus on God is not attractive. The challenge when we don't have strong, vibrant youth generation is that the current generation has to change themselves to reflect the culture and behaviors of the younger generation without them present. So notice on the current image on the screen, Mary's generation now has blue, yellow, purple, and neon blue, which represents that younger missing generation. Unlike previous generations of Eve and Sarah, the elder nor the current generation had to change for the younger generation. It was the young generation that had to change. But without a young generation that's willing to stick around to deal with the power struggles and the socialization that occurs, then the onus is left to the ones present to change. That's hard. That's something that's never been modeled before. That's something that's completely foreign to how we approach a very natural process. Like I said, this occurs in many ways in different contexts, even in family units and so forth. That means it's not enough to be open to others to do what they wish. Olivia is not just wanting to bring vegan food all by herself. So it's not good enough for Mary to say, you can bring your vegan food while we do us. That's not good enough. What Olivia wants is for Mary's generation to also want vegan food just as much as she wants it. But how many of Mary's generation is going to change to veganism? Now, please do not take me too literally here about food and fellowship time. It's not about recognizing, but it's about recognizing the burden that's before the current generation of leadership. If you go back to the story of Deer Lake United's history, one will realize that the current generation of leaders have led Deer Lake United longer than any other generation prior to it. Of course, this generation of leaders is tired and many are burned out. You have been carrying the weight of leadership far longer than any other generation before you, with limited numbers in the younger generation. And now, and I will say this, and I didn't put it in writing, that also, unlike other generations, you didn't actively have to promote the younger generations coming. The younger generations were always just part of the church. It goes back to last week's essay on the baby boomers who rejected the church. The younger generations just were there. They were part of church. That was just part of everyday life. So not only do you have to, like other generations didn't have to change themselves, but other generations didn't have to recruit the way the current generation does. So the burden increases because the truth is, unless those leading of Deer Lake United change themselves, inner transformation, Deer Lake United has very little hope in continuing beyond its current generation. So the big question is the current generation willing to change, to be transformed, and to experience resurrection? My blunt response to that question is I don't know. I look around at this church in the year and a half that I've been here, and I am utterly stunned at the enormous transformation that has occurred. This church stored its money away for a rainy day at the expense of a building that was beyond aged. It was dark, it was dirty, and it smelled. And now walk into the church and look around to see how much light there is, literally and figuratively. We as church just accepted and supported a completely new governance structure unlike anything, dare I suggest, that this church has ever seen before. Both changes, building and governance, are grounded in trust and faith. And these are not the only changes that have occurred. People are acting differently. Conflicts are being addressed. Priorities are shifting. A spiritual hunger is emerging. And this is exciting. Look at this very study and the transformation that has occurred within so many. But there is also, friends, there are also times that we stay in our comfort zone, that we retreat to the known and to the familiar. The voices of fear and control are given too much attention and focus. Will those voices win the day? The scriptures are clear that ultimately they won't. But Deer Lake United's closing isn't ultimate. Those voices, if allowed to control us, will lead us to a path that many of us do not want to manifest. The good news, though, is that we have power here. We have the power to not focus on the fear and the doubt, but on the light and love of God. We have the power to embrace that which makes us uncomfortable. We have the power to heal old wounds, to engage with each other differently. We have the power to care about what the young care about. See the previous sections on what the young care about as far as who comes and why they come. And continually reach out to those who are different than us, showing them that our love, grounded in God's love, is unconditional and redemptive. I am willing to go there, to lead you there, but I can't force you to go there. I can only invite. Yes, the burden of this generation is much heavier than generations in the past. I also will say this is not just Deer Lake United. Many churches are facing this. But with God, all things are possible. With Christ, all burdens are lessened. The only the only thing limiting us is ourselves. The only thing harming us is ourselves. Jesus exasperatedly stated, "You unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" Kind of taken out of context. But the point is, Christ is here waiting for us to stop hurting ourselves, stop doubting, stop not believing, start having the faith, and start following Christ. The invitation will always be there. Are you willing to come and be transformed in following the Christ? Challenges for the future. Reflection question. First one. What is your relationship to power in the church? Where is power in the church? Who has power? What does power get shifted? How does power get shifted throughout time? Number 2, which generation do you believe you are in? Why? Which generation would you like to be in? Why? Next question. A lot of the young generation around, remember, not necessarily about chronological age, but the young generation around Deer Lake United, without a lot of young generation around, how can we educate ourselves for what the younger generations want and desire from the church? So if you remember right, the image, I guess I could go to it real fast. The image was Mary. If you look at Mary's bubble, it has blue, yellow, purple, and neon blue. So that's what each generation contributed to the leadership style. So how do we get that top blue if the young generation isn't here to challenge us and to kind of, present that to us and let us choose or force us to take that? What does that look like? And then number 4, what are the challenges before us as a church? So I named one generationally with power. What are yours? What are some possible solutions? Who should be part of determining those solutions? And then the last one for this section, how do we as a church manage the voices of fear and control? They're not going anywhere. We all have them. We all do. And me. So how do we manage them? And what can be done to improve so that we're not controlled by these voices? And I laughed at the irony as I was writing that question of being controlled by the voice of control, but it's true. So how do we do that? Every single one of us. All right. Let's move on and let's see what the next one is, which again, I forgot which one it is. So I'm doing them one at a time. So I'll see you in the next video.